Everything you need to know about the Dark Voyage, understanding the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade, spanning from the 16th to the 19th century, stands as one of the most devastating chapters in human history. Over 12 to 15 million Africans were forcibly removed from their homelands, enduring unimaginable suffering as they were enslaved and shipped across the vast Atlantic Ocean. This documentary explores the origins, inner workings, human cost, and enduring legacies of the Atlantic slave trade, offering a poignant reflection on a system that reshaped the world and left deep scars behind. The roots of the Atlantic slave trade lay in the age of European exploration and colonization. As Spain, Portugal, Britain, and other European powers expanded into the Americas, they sought wealth through the cultivation of lucrative crops like sugar, cotton, and tobacco. These crops required an immense labor force, one that native populations could not sustain due to disease, displacement, and death caused by colonization. African societies, rich with people but fragmented by internal conflicts and competing kingdoms, were seen as a resource to exploit. European merchants turned to Africa, establishing a brutal system that commodified human lives. This marked the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, spanning over 300 years. The trade began with small-scale exchanges on the West African coast, before expanding into a vast network involving African, European, and American players. European traders established fortresses along the African coastline, partnering with African rulers, warlords, and merchants. These local leaders often provided captives from rival tribes or prisoners of war in exchange for guns, textiles, and other manufactured goods. However, these alliances were not uniform acts of complicity. Some African communities fiercely resisted the encroachment of the European slave trade, but many found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by the economic incentives of the trade. The transatlantic exchange of goods and enslaved people is often referred to as the triangular trade. This triangular route connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a web of cruelty and profit. From Europe, ships loaded with textiles, weapons, and manufactured goods sailed to the African coast. These items were traded for human beings, who were brutally captured and sold. Finally, the ships returned to Europe laden with sugar, cotton, tobacco, and other produce cultivated by enslaved labor on plantations. The triangular trade became an economic powerhouse, enriching European nations and elites while devastating millions of lives. The entire system was built on violence, exploitation, and racism, with profit placed above human dignity. The process of enslavement began in Africa with raiding parties, organized kidnappings, or the sale of war captives. Men, women, and even children were torn from their homes and communities, stripped of their rights and autonomy. Captured individuals were often marched long distances to the coast, shackled together, and forced to endure the painful journey to trading forts. At these coastal outposts, they were inspected, branded, and sold at auctions. Families were callously split apart, bonds of kinship severed forever as human beings were reduced to commodities. The trauma of capture and the dehumanization of the trade's machinery left deep, lasting scars on African societies, breaking apart communities and destroying cultural cohesion. The Middle Passage refers to the agonizing transatlantic voyage that enslaved Africans endured on their way to the Americas. Packed into overcrowded ships, the enslaved were treated as cargo rather than as humans. Conditions aboard these vessels were nightmarish. Men, women, and children were chained together in cramped quarters, with little ventilation and no sanitation. Diseases like dysentery and smallpox spread rapidly. Starvation, dehydration, and abuse were rampant. Those who resisted or fell ill were often thrown overboard to prevent others from becoming sick. It is estimated that millions of lives were lost during the journey. Historians believe the mortality rate during the Middle Passage was as high as 20%. Survivors arrived in the Americas weakened, traumatized, and horrified by the realities ahead. Upon reaching the Americas, enslaved Africans were placed on auction blocks, one of the most harrowing aspects of their journey. Families were separated as they were sold to plantation owners or landowners seeking cheap labor. This process further erased their identities, replacing their names and stripping them of their cultural ties. The enslaved were subjected to brutal working conditions, particularly on plantations producing sugar, cotton, and tobacco. They worked long hours under the scalding sun, poorly fed and punished ruthlessly for any perceived insubordination. many plantation owners enacted policies of seasoning, a process designed to break the spirit of the enslaved and condition them for a life of submission. At the same time, slaveholders sought to erase the cultural identities of enslaved Africans by denying them access to their languages, religions, and traditions. Yet amidst such relentless oppression, enslaved individuals demonstrated remarkable resilience, finding ways to preserve their heritage and humanity. Despite the extraordinary suffering that enslaved Africans endured, many resisted. Some revolted aboard ships, staging attacks on captains and crew. Others ran away, forming communities of escaped slaves, known as Maroons, in isolated areas. These communities became bastions of African cultural survival and resistance. Rebellion also took root on plantations. Armed uprisings, sabotage, and the covert preservation of African traditions served as defiance against the horrors of slavery. Stories and songs passed down through generations kept alive a resistance that could not be extinguished. Some of the most notable examples of resistance include the Haitian Revolution, an abolitionist rebellion that established Haiti as the first free black republic, and the Amistad slave ship revolt, which became a key symbol of the fight against slavery. The fight to end the Atlantic slave trade and slavery itself gained momentum in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Abolitionist movements rose in Europe and the Americas, driven by activists, formerly enslaved individuals, and organizations like the Quakers. Speeches, literature, and accounts by individuals such as Olaudah Equiano humanized the plight of the enslaved and galvanized support for the abolitionist cause. Economic factors also played a role, as industrialization reduced the dependence on manual, plantation labor. By the mid-1800s, slavery was being abolished in most parts of the Western world, although illegal trade and exploitation persisted. The abolition of slavery did not, however, erase its legacies. Deep economic and racial inequalities persisted in both African and African-descended communities worldwide. The aftermath of the Atlantic slave trade left scars globally. African societies faced demographic devastation, political instability, and economic hardship. Entire communities had been drained of their people, thwarting progress and leaving nations vulnerable to exploitation during the colonial era. In the Americas and Europe, the legacies of slavery were equally pervasive. The racist ideologies used to justify slavery laid the foundation for systemic inequalities that persist to this day. African-descended communities have had to contend with the social and economic barriers erected in the post-slavery world. At the same time, African diaspora cultures have had a profound influence on the world. The rhythms of enslaved laborers' songs survived to shape global music, from jazz to hip-hop. Artistic, culinary, and religious traditions from Africa were preserved and adapted, creating vibrant cultures in the Americas and beyond. Understanding the Atlantic slave trade is not simply an act of looking at the past. It is a tool to understand injustices that continue today. By confronting the inhumanity of these systems, societies can reflect on the global inequalities rooted in this history. This documentary seeks to honor the resilience and courage of those enslaved, while reminding us of the importance of confronting our shared history. To learn from this dark chapter is to ensure that the injustices of the past do not define the future. It is a collective call to create a world that values humanity, freedom, and equality above all else.